Good morning. My name is Luke Langdon, and my thesis is on intellectual property and the corruption of copyright. Starting from as early as the 5th century during the Anglo-Saxon period, English commoners subsisted off of communal land to allow their livestock to graze pastures and farm crops in rotation with others. The system was managed collectively and cooperatively for the benefit of all who used it, and had been historically proven to support the working class. As the early industrial age of England began, Parliament would begin implementing the use of enclosure, a privatized sectoring of land. Between 1760 and 1860, millions of acres of land were enclosed by acts of Parliament and given to the upper class to control. While economic productivity did increase, this effectively exterminated the agrarian commoner, as the livelihood of their existences had been shut off. What ensued was the mass depopulation of rural areas and the large-scale migration to urban cities, where commoners were forced to submit themselves to wage labor, sparking an influx of poverty and socioeconomic imbalance. In the end, what was once owned by many had been consolidated into an ownership for a wealthy few, and an entire society had been reshaped into an industrial monopoly through a great cost to ordinary people. American society, just like England, has always valued private property as a right of life. One of the government's primary tasks has been to protect citizens' property from being abused or mistreated, to decipher what is public and what is private. Aristotle describes the dynamic of private property in his philosophical study Politics, where he states that it is clearly better that property should be private, but the use of it common, and the special business of the legislature is to create men in this benevolent disposition. This function not only applies to physical possessions, but also to the ideas, creations, and works of art and literature that is defined as intellectual property. Intellectual property, or IP, is divided into three main classifications that determine the nature, use, and rights of the owner: copyrights, patents, and trademarks. While this paper focuses primarily on copyrights, patents and trademarks are important to mention briefly in order to compare their purpose. The World Intellectual Property Organization defines a patent as an exclusive right granted for an invention that gives the patent owner the right to decide how or whether the invention can be used by others, and defines a trademark as a sign capable of distinguishing the goods or services of one enterprise from those of other enterprises. Copyrights, though, can be defined as a legal term used to describe the rights that creators have over their literary and artistic works, and the scope of material that encompasses that description is quite large. Books, musics, paintings, films, sculptures, computer programs, databases, advertisements, maps, and technical drawings are all considered copyrightable works. Unlike patents and trademarks, copyrights are established on their creation and do not need to be registered. Possessing a copyright allows the owner to have control over the distribution, replication, and performance of the work. Under U.S. law, a copyrighted work lasts 95 years from publication or 120 years from creation for corporate works, and for works of an author, it lasts a lifetime plus 70 years. Copyright's length is especially surprising compared to its IP relatives, as a patent initially only lasts for 20 years and a trademark for 6 years. This makes copyright the strongest and most developed intellectual property available, and its power has taken center stage in the modern U.S. economy. For an individual consumer, copyright's significance may be hard to realize, but it affects the price of all copyrighted products. It has a taxing effect on every form of media and artistic design a consumer buys, and economics predict it adds up to $6,000 per person per year. Intellectual property has become the single greatest sector of foreign sales in the American economy, and in 2024, the U.S. accumulated $169 billion from IP sales. The total sum of sales around the globe that same year was $538 billion, meaning the U.S. accounts for nearly a third of all global IP value. The reality of American IP is that a majority of copyrights are held by large corporations who control a massive empire of creative works, and most of the interaction with the law is happening between enormous businesses, not individual creators. Companies like Disney, Google, Meta, and Amazon are entirely constituted by the sheer volume of intellectual property they own, and the average person is not aware of how far their control extends. Especially now, the need for a fair and balanced set of laws is essential when so much money is involved and intellectual property is as abundant as it is. Unfortunately, this is not true for copyright laws today in America. From the conception of intellectual property by classical Greek philosophers to the corporate battlefield of copyright today, intellectual property has slowly changed, leaning more and more towards the business conglomerates that control the media market today. Intellectual property was first thought to protect the rights of creators by honoring their literary and philosophical works as their own property. In the circulation of ideas that modeled the ancient world of thinkers, there existed a code of honor that was the basis for distinguishing the works of great minds. As time progressed, technology made the making and distribution of information easier through the invention of the printing press, and a business arose in bookmaking. As a result, a conflict started about who had the means of selling books. So in 1710, England released the Statute of Anne, the first copyright law, which stated that authors had the sole right over their works for 14 years and could renew it for 14 more years if they were still alive. This act suppressed the monopoly that the booksellers were exploiting and gave authors protection over their works for a period of time before entering the public domain. As the scope of copyright protection evolved and the need for copyright law reached new countries like the United States, that 14-year protection was extended longer and longer until it lasted nearly a century or more. The copyright laws that America have set in place have tipped the scale of freedom and intellectual property rights overwhelmingly toward massive businesses who, with the current set of rules, are more equipped to take advantage of the legislation. A reformation of America's copyright laws would encourage innovation, benefit public creative media and individual authorship, and still protect the rights of owners while not allowing excessive corporate overtake. When America's copyright laws were written, knowledge of what was considered intellectual property was still growing and evolving, and the 1976 Copyright Act enforced its expansion. Now, copyright had advanced beyond just books and music and had reached into film, photography, software, and artistic design. The 1976 Copyright Act declares in Section 106 that copyright owners have the exclusive right to prepare derivative works based upon the copyrighted work, which includes reproducing copies, performing publicly, or openly displaying copyrighted material. This section fortified copyright protection, as all secondary uses of a copyrighted work is technically considered infringement. And with such a wide area of grounds that the law covers, the decision of secondary use became unclear. Section 107 of the Act tries to combat this problem by allowing some cases of secondary use to be categorized as fair use and legal to apply. The problem with this is that the word fair is an exceptionally vague term with different meanings, and the law never really defines fair use. Instead, it gives a list of applicable conditions and judgments on if fair use is justified, as it states that, for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, or research is not an infringement of copyright. It then lists factors to be considered for the ruling of fair use, which include the purpose and character of the use, including whether such use is of a commercial nature or is for nonprofit educational purposes, the nature of the copyrighted work, the amount and substantiality of the portion used in relation to the copyrighted work as a whole, and the effect of the use upon the potential market for or value of a copyrighted work. For a legal instrument, these factors are quite indistinct. It does not state whether all factors must be met or whether some are more important than others. The factors themselves can be interpreted many different ways. The nature of a copyrighted work serves many purposes, but the law only confines itself to a commercial nature, completely discounting any other characteristic about the work. A better way of addressing fair use is by saying that some factors like market harm and transformative purpose are primary and secondary factors that should be considered first in ruling. Adding a safe harbor category of presumptive free use scenarios like small quotations for commentary or non-commercial remixes would help make common cases more predictable. As well, the law should better define fair and transformative use, like stating whether it gives new meaning, serves a different function, or changes the context of the work. The goal of reforming fair use is to make cases easier to predict while still allowing the flexibility that the courts already provide, as they are exceedingly fact-dependent. It seems like these laws were never written with the interest of the public in mind. In fact, the 1976 Copyright Act rarely ever includes the word public and never once mentions public interest. That's because the writers of these laws were not concerned about public interest. These laws were written by lobbyists from large corporations who sought a way to rig the system towards themselves. Alexandre Montagu and David Bellos best explain it in their book, Who Owns This Sentence? Whatever is made public by publication becomes public property in the most obvious and irreversible way, yet copyright makes it private again. For 200 years, the U.S. was reluctant to abuse the copyright system and participate in cross-border regulations. But 50 years ago, they realized the power and income they could generate and imposed their new system everywhere around the world. When trying to understand the wealth gap in modern society, copyright laws have gone under the radar, yet are one of the biggest contributing factors to the complication. What makes copyright so accessible for large companies to abuse is the cost to distribute intellectual property requires no packing or shipping, and your return value is exceptional. That's why foreign sales of intellectual property is the highest earning sector of the American economy, and other poorer countries are now forced to pay American businesses in what vast items copyrights cover. Authors' incomes have slowly declined as companies now control the market of creative works and make money in one of the easiest ways possible. Many early writers and thinkers of past times once predicted a future when a monopoly would come from intellectual property. What was once the right of the public would become a resource of the elite, serving as an engine of inequality between rich and poor. Society is a self-sufficient creator of its culture. It involves multiple individuals participating in intellectual works that are perfected and interpreted in different ways. Many great inventions are not the product of one person, but a group of people who work together to achieve something. While the invention of the light bulb is often credited to Thomas Edison, the first electrical light design was made by Humphrey Davy in 1802, and then inventors and scientists like Joseph Swan and Henry Woodward kept improving it before Edison made his discoveries and created the modern light bulb. The design of the light bulb was still perfected after Edison's time, and together, inventors created a staple of electrical innovation. This progressive way of innovation has never been thwarted more than now. In modern business, musical artists and companies are not only obligated, but are incentivized to sue anyone who uses any riff, melody, or lyric that is remotely close to anything they have ever made. Online media creators are regularly demonetized for the use of copyrighted material on the basis of infringement, even though their work is transformative of the content. The problem lies in the fact that modern copyright laws are not parallel with the way art, media, and information are shared today. These laws, written in the late 20th century when barely anyone used the internet, and they were written by lawmakers who did not understand the fundamental way intellectual property would be shared online. Big businesses now dominate the way intellectual property is shared. It is not used to benefit the artist or the culture of society. It is, in fact, used to extort as much money as possible from the people below them. In the present age of intellectual property, countries are united under one convention that contains 180 nations and simplifies regulations and trade relations called the Berne Convention. In order to participate in the convention, companies are required to meet minimum strength and protection laws that ensure a work is automatically protected from its creation and covers all literary and artistic work. The minimum requirement for works of a corporation is 50 years from publication, and the minimum requirement for works of an author is life plus 50 years. As of now, the United States is the most dominant figure in the convention with the largest revenue for intellectual property. Those who object to copyright reform might argue that should the laws be weakened to shorten copyright length, America's intellectual property would become less competitive with other countries, ruin the United States economy that is already fixed for strong copyright protection, and reduce incentives for artists as they would have less control over their work. Advocates of modern copyright might mention that the United States has led the world in accepting strong copyright protection, and to turn back on that standard is a risky maneuver. No such revisions can violate the minimum requirements of the treaty, as it would break our treaty with numerous other countries and set a bad precedent for trade relations. That does not mean a revision would break the treaty if it still met the minimum requirements. As of now, the United States surpasses every country in their copyright length, and some by double. Since the treaty has no maximum requirements, countries have slowly been increasing their copyright length simply because it has become the norm that countries like the United States have pressured others into accepting. There is no limit on how far these countries are willing to extend their copyright length, and the trend only goes upward. Since the United States has so much power in the intellectual property trade, weakening their laws could encourage other countries into reconsidering their stringent legislation, but still abide by the Berne Convention. Reducing the length of years that a copyright can be owned, say from 70 years to 50 years for works after an author's death, or from 95 years to 70 years for works of corporations, puts the United States at equal ground with many other first world countries and stops the excessive gatekeeping that countries have been practicing. The United States Constitution places a great deal of importance on the protection of private property. In the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution, it states that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. If the United States reduces the length of copyright, many works would automatically enter the public domain and provide no compensation for the owner. Those who object to copyright reform will argue then that it would be unconstitutional because it takes private property away from its owner into the public without compensation. But what if there was a way to make it constitutionally acceptable? While giving authors just compensation for their works before they enter the public domain is a possibility, the process of deciding how much a specific work should be given is no simple task. The amount a certain work makes in its lifespan is not a predictable measure, as demand for it changes with time, so any estimates are not reliable. The most optimal way to confront this problem is by allowing works created until a specific date fall under the current longer copyright length, and then all created works after that specific date have a shorter length under the new legislation. This method makes sure that no works is unjustly taken from the owner and provides a smoother transition into the new age of copyright length. What is currently happening to America's copyright laws is nothing new. All throughout history, societies have been exploited by the elites through the endeavor of property and the ever-consuming greed of fortune. Much like the English peasants of the 17th century, American citizens have been forced into a system that has taken basic liberties and turned it into a money-making machine for the upper class. The current copyright laws stand on verbal sophistry, not coherent principles, that allows the legislations to be exploited by those who own the most intellectual property. The lucrative scheme of copyright has been hiding under the public's nose for decades, but continues to invade every facet of day-to-day life. The benefits that would result from a change of legislation regarding copyright length and fair use would undoubtedly help stop individual creators' income from slowly declining and give good effort in restoring the massive wealth inequality that America has created. Cries from large corporations, politicians, and lobbyists would rain down immensely, and warnings of total economic collapse would come from every corner of the media, but those cries have no truth behind them. The arguments presented against a change of copyright can be addressed in a way that retains the rights of owners, protects capitalistic practices, and still allows giant corporations to operate in a system that respects their ownership of intellectual property, but limits extreme abuse in business. When stripping away all the complexity of copyright, what lies underneath is the common vice of greed, a vice that is preached against in the Bible numerous times. In the Old Testament, a law stated that all land shall be returned to its ancestral owner in the year of Jubilee. Some Israelites, however, rejected this law and began driving weaker people off the land that God had promised them, disrupting the equality that God was trying to maintain among his people. Isaiah warns those who do business without the Lord that because of their greed, their yield shall be low in the time of harvest, for the land they stand on is not theirs. It's time for America to return to a common land of intellectual property. Thank you. I would now like to take questions from the judges. Mr. Davis.
Great job, Luke. In your paper, but not so much in your presentation, you talked a lot about AI and some of the problems that it creates. And it seems like AI is single-handedly destroying a lot of copyright realities. I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yes. So copyright right now, or AI right now, you're not allowed to copyright a work that's mostly made by an AI. That has already been mostly settled. I think most media companies they're not trying to push like an AI-centered media forward. What seems to be the bigger problem is, can companies use copyrighted material to train their AI? That has been a dispute going on in the courts. It's been split. Some courts say, yes, this is allowed, and others say, no, you're not allowed to do this. I would really like a legislation regarding how companies use copyrighted material to train their AI, because right now, really, people are just making inferences on what other courts have decided. So if that answers your question, yes.
Right, yeah, thank you.
I hear you saying that a lot of our publishing is owned by a small number of huge companies and really taking advantage of creators. And I've seen that with friends who have books that are well-written, great books, but if they publish it, they give the ownership to the company. And the company makes all the money and they get pennies. I'm wondering, is there a place in the next 100 years for Christian entrepreneurs to come in, forgetting about government regulation and laws? But how can Christian entrepreneurs come in to the publishing industry and make it more just?
Christian entrepreneurs, like people who are trying to push business.
Yeah, like if I were a Christian, I wanted to be a publisher, how can I make it better in the way that you're saying?
Well, I would love if people wanted to go through a publishing company, they could give their books to a publishing company, but still retain some of the rights so that way that they're not losing like all of their ownership of a book. And really, I guess it's just how successful can your book be if you're going through like a major publishing company. But I definitely would like legislation regarding the original owner. If they're going through a publishing company, you know, the publishing group can't, you know, make legal decisions based off that without, you know, confronting the owner. So, yes.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question, Luke.
Yes.
So we talked a lot over this year about like intentionality, I think, and like corporate control. So I'm wondering what you think is the true intentionality. Do you think that the corporate control was like sinister and intentional, or do you think that maybe it was like a product of the passage of time? Like these things are super old, right? Like some of these things are.
I definitely believe it was intentional because people from like Disney was like lobbying with Congress to help extend copyright length, and they were basically like hand in hand writing what our current copyright laws are. So I definitely feel like it's intentional on purpose because the amount of money that these corporations are making on their intellectual property, because the law allows them to do that, is I think why. But you also have a lot of things that were made before all these laws are written, and now they're being applied to this current law. So you have like some works being protected for like 120 years, which is insanely long. But then you also have like the new media that's coming out that is not compatible with the new law just because of how like viral media has become and how intellectual property is shared now, that our system is outdated. So, and it definitely favors corporations over individual creators. So I would love to have new legislation that makes that more of a balance so it's not such an unchecked power. But I definitely feel like the legislatures knew what they were doing when they wrote these laws.
Luke, when you first presented this topic, I really didn't know what it was going to turn into. And so you told me about the Happy Birthday song. You said, you'll understand this. And you explained the history of that. I was going to see if you wanted to share that. That's what got me on board with this idea.
Yes, so the Happy Birthday song was created in 1893, and it was kind of exchanged through rights holders throughout the years, but eventually it got to the point where it was over 100 years long that people were owning them. And one company, the Warner Chappell Music Group, they had possession over that song, and they were trying to sue an independent filmmaker for trying to make a documentary about the song. And the filmmaker took them to court, and then the court realized that this has been protected for way too long. So they released it into the public domain, but just kind of the excessive gatekeeping that the countries have been practicing, the fact that the Happy Birthday song, which is the most recognizable song in the world, can be under copyright protection for over a century it's insane to me.
Let me ask a question that relates to that. So that seems like overprotection, but then in the last few years, the copyright on Winnie the Pooh came up. And then within days, there's a low-budget, awful horror movie that's tasteless and terrible about Winnie the Pooh being a mass murderer. And then the same thing's happening with Mickey Mouse. Wouldn't you... protecting the Happy Birthday song from being sung seems silly, but protecting Winnie the Pooh from becoming a mass murderer seems legit. So where's the middle ground that you're proposing?
The law cannot control what people do with intellectual property when it's gone into the public domain. And there's been, I'm sure, countless other things that happen like that.
Yeah.
Like, well, a lot farther down, like,
Sure.
because Disney used to make all of their movies off of things in the public domain, like The Wizard of Oz and stuff like that. So the law can't really govern what people are doing with intellectual property. It probably matters more how it's monetized by the people who are owning it. So,
Thank you.
I have a question. My question is just, you seem to know a lot about this, Luke. I'm glad to know that Happy Birthday isn't like owned by Disney. But why is this important to you? Like, why is it important to you?
to me, well, honestly, I chose the topic just because it was just a rabbit hole I went down on the internet and I became really invested in. And I was like, more people should know about this because it affects everybody in here. Like the things you buy, they're getting more expensive because of intellectual property rights. And I'm going into communications, and that has to do with media. And I'm kind of just wondering like how the law will play out in my time using it. But I guess the main point is I wanted to make people aware of what's going on, just because it's not many people know about it. So, but it's affecting them a lot.
So Mr. Drotty stole my question.
Sorry.
You should have copyrighted it.
Should have. The most interesting or thing that you said that stuck out the most to me is the law cannot govern intellect. That's a loose paraphrase, but yes. So this has been a long process for you guys, 2 years. Is this where you started and what you stuck with the whole time?
No, I was originally doing my thesis on wartime censorship.
That's what I thought, and that's what I was expecting, and I kept waiting for you to get there, and it never came, and I thought, I'm so confused.
I quickly realized I did not agree with the argument I was making, so I just scrapped it, and I was way more passionate about this topic, and that helped me a lot because I actually enjoyed researching and writing this. So.
And that was going to be the next part of my question. What's the most interesting thing that you discovered in your research with this?
Probably just all the things that are copyrighted, like the Eiffel Tower, the lights on it are copyrighted, money is copyrighted, you're not allowed to use real money in films, and how long something can be copyrighted for, like the Happy Birthday song. It affects, just seeing how much it affects was really surprising to me.
So when you say the Eiffel Tower, you mean any type of...
So if you take at night specifically, because the lights on it are copyrighted, so if you take a picture of it at night, you can't use that in any commercial purpose at all because somebody has the rights to it. But during the day, I guess it's fine.
Well, I hope so, because oddly, I have a lovely little Eiffel Tower that hangs on my keychain that was given to me by your sister.
So the other day I was in a rabbit hole on YouTube and saw Lauren Daigle singing with Chris Stapleton, and it blew me away. And then I realized this isn't a real song. These are really their faces, their voices. It's an AI song, and I'm like, how does that even happen? How do they use that copyright? I'm curious if you could help me understand that.
I guess it has enough human intervention to be copyrightable. I guess if it's coming from that big of an artist, then yes. I'm not really sure what the litmus test on is, how people are deciding, yes, this doesn't use enough AR or this does use enough AI to be monetized or not. But I guess for right now, that is allowed. But for things that are like purely made by AI, like a completely AI generated video that basically has no like distinguishable people in the real world in it, that's not copyrightable. But I guess that crosses the line to where it can be mainstream. So,
Thank you.
I'm fascinated by this, the statistic you said that the amount, $6,000 per person per year, you're saying that is the amount of money that every person pays based on embedded costs in...
yeah,
Go ahead.
that money goes to the rights holders who own it. It's slowly like a small tax that's been incorporated to all intellectual property, so like books or music, that there's like a small like tax in it for the intellectual property rights that goes to the owner. And that the research for that was in 2018, so I imagine it's gone up a lot, but yes, it has a taxing effect on intellectual property that you buy
Is there
in
a
small
difference
amounts.
between a copyright and a patent?
Yes, so a patent only applies to an invention, and it lasts for 20 years initially. You can renew it for another 20 years, I believe, afterwards.
Okay.
But copyright applies to like books, music, it's literary and artistic works. But because the law has been stretched, like software is now considered a literary work, maps are. So I would rather the copyright system favor more towards the patent system because it doesn't last as long, and it gives like the inventor of the machine time to make money off of their invention, and then it goes in the public domain 40 years later, which would be a lot preferable for the things that copyrights cover instead of it lasting a century long. But that's the difference between a copyright.
Thank you.
Okay, well, Luke, I'm glad you changed your topic. You did a great job with this, and you did it with such ease. So I'm so proud of you. Good job. But Luke, you were finished. Yay!